the firewood was wet again. It didn't matter how carefully you'd stacked it under the awning. The snow seemed to have an agenda, creeping sideways through the planks as if it fancied your logs partly boiled, not roasted. That meant the kindling smoked like an awkward teenager at his first barn dance. Lots of heat, very little flame. Out on the prairie, during the long winters of the 1800s, American settlers quickly discovered that nature played by its own rules. And those rules were often, don't sleep too deeply, don't blink too long, and never turn your back on porridge. Let's begin in a tiny log cabin on the frontier, Montana Territory maybe, or somewhere equally snow-laden and optimism deficient. Picture 2 adults, 3 children, 1 cat that regrets everything, and a homemade quilt that's trying, heroically, to cover knees, elbows, and at least 1 neighboring county. Life on the frontier rewarded practicality over flair. The fanciest item anyone owned was, usually, a cast-iron stove, with legs like a retired blacksmith. Sturdy, slightly bowed, and prone to complaints in cold weather. Inside those stoves, settlers burned everything from pine logs to dried-out corn cobs, buffalo chips, and occasionally, hope. Homes were often built quickly, with whatever was on hand, logs, sod, or planks if you were lucky, and had a cousin who owed you lumber. Insulation. That was a luxury. If the wind couldn't whistle straight through your kitchen and out the back wall, people wondered what you were hiding. To stay warm, folks layered clothing the way modern people layer excuses. Woolen underwear, flannel shirts, shawls, and anything else not currently being used as a curtain. Some even wore mittens to bed. A charming thought until you recall they were made of scratchy yarn and slightly smelled of goat. Food was fuel before it was flavor. A popular winter meal was stew, which could contain pretty much anything. Beans, potatoes, old carrots, salt, pork if you'd planned ahead, and unidentifiable bits that even the family dog refused to investigate. Porridge, the reliable grey glue of the frontier diet, could be served hot, cold, or suspicious, and leftovers might be fried into patties the next day. Historians don't know what they tasted like because nobody left a record of eating them and living. Still, there were cozy moments. Those long evenings when the oil lamp flickered, someone read aloud from a worn Bible or the same 3 chapters of Robinson Crusoe for the 10th time. Children would curl close, drowsy with warmth, as snow whispered against the shutters. In those moments, the harshness of winter softened slightly, cloaked in the scent of wood smoke and boiled root vegetables. Entertainment didn't require fingertips, just imagination. Knitting was practically a competitive sport. One Kansas settler reportedly knit 18 mittens by January and never found their matches. They were simply lost in the eternal sock dimension that all households eventually open a portal to. Many frontier families believed deeply in community. If your cow froze solid by Valentine's Day, your neighbor might lend you some milk, provided you helped unfreeze his chickens. There was a remarkable barter economy based on trust, resourcefulness, and livestock that constantly tested the boundaries of common sense. For drinking water, unless you lived inconveniently close to a spring, you shoveled snow into a pot and waited, and waited. Melting snow for water is the kind of task that tricks you. A heaping bucket becomes half a teacup, which is why no one washed anything but hands, faces, and sins until spring. Through it all, settlers pressed on, not because they relished frostbite or found blizzards character building, but because they had named this patch of wilderness theirs. They were determined to outlast the wind, the feral raccoons, and the endless, freezing nights. So tonight, as your own modern heat hums gently from a nearby vent, and you rest under 3 pillows and a blanket that doesn't smell like pickled beets, spare a little thought for the brave, slightly cold, occasionally porridge-addled souls who called the West home centuries ago. Their courage wasn't grand speeches or trumpets on horseback. It was getting up the next morning, putting one unwashed foot in front of the other, and facing another day of powdered eggs and stiff socks. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, lie back. The kettle's about to whistle, and the snow. It hasn't quite stopped falling. There was no such thing as central heating on the high plains. No furnace tucked away in a basement. No thermostat blinking cheerfully from the wall. Just a fire, or if you were particularly fortunate, a temperamental iron stove that roared at one end while the opposite corner of the cabin froze like the dark side of the moon. Winter crept in with the subtle grace of a mule with sore feet, announcing itself less with a chill and more with a full-body wrestling match. The settlers, those hardy inventors of comfort in a land that had very little to offer, responded with equal ingenuity and a healthy amount of stubbornness. Let's start with the cabins themselves. These weren't your storybook log palaces with civility and varnish. No, these were hastily raised rectangles of ambition and axe work, usually built with whatever timber you could convince not to fall apart by Tuesday. Insulation, as we might understand it, was largely theoretical. Some settlers stuffed cracks with moss or old rags. Others relied on mud daubing, which worked to an extent, but had an unfortunate tendency to crumble when damp, shrinking away from log seams precisely when warmth was needed most. As a result, many cabins in the West were not so much homes as they were wooden sieves surrounded by snowdrifts. And yet, people didn't just survive. They adapted with the sort of gritty creativity one only discovers when the alternative is an icy death, or possibly worse, having to ask Ted the neighbor for firewood. Layering was an art form. Wool was worth its weight in gold, and long johns were the uniform of the season, worn with such devotion that some folks joked about not seeing their own knees from October to March. Nightwear consisted mostly of, yes, whatever you had. Furs, quilts, old coats, toe sacks tied around your feet. You slept in it. There's record of one rather pragmatic pioneer woman sewing a coat big enough for her and 2 children to sleep in together. It wasn't stylish, but fashion isn't terribly persuasive after sundown, when the inside of your cabin feels like a snow globe. People slept close too. Sharing body heat was not merely cozy, it was physics. Entire families piled into beds like spoons in a drawer. Personal space wasn't exactly a frontier concept at the best of times, and in winter months, it vanished entirely. Grandparents, parents, children, and occasionally a dog or chicken, all huddled together under layers of hand-stitched quilts stuffed with anything from feathers to newspapers. Yes, newspapers. Printed words had 2 purposes in the West: informing and insulating. Old papers were crumpled and sewn into layers between fabric like a wearable editorial. It wasn't uncommon to find yourself wrapped in last year's news about cattle prices or mishaps with regional outlaws. History, quite literally, kept people warm. But heat required fuel, and fuel often meant chopping and splitting until your arms felt like noodles. The image of a man standing heroically by a log pile is fine for paintings, but out there, fetching firewood in blizzard conditions was less romance and more risk. Some burned buffalo chips. Yes, the dried remnants left behind by roaming bison. They were plentiful, surprisingly efficient, and as long as you didn't think too hard about the aroma, quite practical. And then, of course, there were the stoves. Majestic, cast-iron finicky things that smoked when they felt like it, sulked when the wind blew wrong, and functioned more like temperamental cats than mechanical objects. You'd coax them to life with kindling and whispered promises, adjusting vents with the care of a safecracker trying not to trip the alarm. Cooking in winter was its own improvisation. Cabbage, root vegetables, beans, foods that could survive months without refrigeration, mostly because refrigeration was, well, everywhere. If you left your potatoes by the stove, they lasted longer. Leave them anywhere else, and they turned into small, icy boulders. Still, within those frigid walls, people found warmth not just through fire, but through ritual, reading by lantern light, whittling by the stove, telling stories, playing fiddle tunes, writing letters into the void. Winter was long, cold, and relentless, but it was also a time of stillness, a pause between the rushing madness of planting and harvest, a frozen breath in the year's long sentence. And so, as the snow fell silent across the prairie, the world held its breath. Inside the creaking cabin walls, someone adjusted a quilt. A log fell with a gentle hiss in the stove, and dreams drifted like slow smoke toward rafters laced with frost. Of course, things weren't always so calm, especially when it came to food preservation. A topic best left for when the fire has a little more bite and the beans are bubbling gently in the pot. When the wind howled low across the Great Plains and clung to the ragged fences like a ghost trying to hitch a ride, settlers knew winter was serious. Not politely brushing snow off your shoulders kind of serious, but the sort of cold that made a tin cup stick to your lip if you were fool enough to drink from its outside. And bless their chapped little hearts, the hardy folks of the frontier learned to outwit the winter, or at least make peace with it. You see, living in a sod house during a frost-heavy December was an experience. The walls might have been thick, made of tightly packed earth bricks and dreams of a root cellar. But insulation, that was more of a philosophical concept than a reality. Still, settlers carried on, cozied up under patchwork quilts, which were less design choices and more stitched-together survival strategies. At the heart of the cabin, there crackled the soul of warmth, the iron stove. Oh, the iron stove, black, squat, and unapologetically temperamental, was the crown jewel of many a drafty shack. It had one job: burn wood like an enthusiastic poet burns through metaphors. And burn it did, if you had any left. Wood had to be chopped and stacked high before the snows came. The settlers used every daylight hour in autumn splitting logs until their arms ached and their complaints blew away uselessly into the prairie wind. That woodpile wasn't just fuel. It was a winter insurance policy. But unlike modern insurance, you couldn't call anyone if it ran out. You just got a lecture from your neighbor 6 miles away about how they had enough because they started chopping in August, followed by a begrudging loan of half a stack, because prairie etiquette closely resembled kindergarten sharing rules, enforced with rifles. Now, the stove wasn't just a heater. It was a heating system, cooktop, drying rack, foot warmer, and sometimes a disappointing bread oven. Settlers would place their boots near the base, gloves on the stovepipe, and, if they were truly desperate, a biscuit inside, which often emerged baked like a stone with the personality of disappointment. Still, it beat eating snow, although some did try that too, just once. Then there were windows, or rather, what they generously called windows. Glass was expensive and fragile, the two worst attributes for anything exposed to a Nebraska blizzard. So oilskin, paper, or even thin muslin might be tacked up instead, smeared with animal fat to make it sort of see-through but not quite. The result was that cabins often glowed dimly like lanterns in a fog. Cozy? Yes. Easy to navigate with socks on? Not at all. More than one settler stubbed a toe before sunrise and loudly questioned the manifest destiny of their pinky toe. The cold crept in regardless. Every morning, settlers would wake to frost forming inside the cabin, snuggling the window frame like a bored kitten. Icicles dangled from roof beams. Breath steamed in the air, mingling with the scent of last night's stew, worn-up moccasins, and the ever-present bouquet of unwashed wool. Bedrooms, used loosely here to mean the bed area behind the curtain, were communal. Families slept in tight huddles, like socially exhausted penguins. Layer upon layer of clothing blurred the line between pajamas and Tuesday's outfit. If you misplaced your sock in bed, you might not find it until March. Bathing. Oh, heavens. Winter bathing was an activity so rare it could be used as a calendar marker. When was the last time you had a bath? Someone would ask, and you'd say, before old man Harlan froze his nose hair solid. So, mid-November, I'm guessing. A metal tub was dragged near the stove, filled with heated water from the melting of snow, if needed, and used cautiously, lest your bare bits catch a chill. Everyone took turns, starting with the cleanest in the house, usually babies or guests. By the end, the water looked less like a bath and more like the stew you regretted last week. Still, even in the deep grasp of winter, life in those cold cabins rolled on with a peculiar charm. Laughter echoed under low ceilings. Folk songs were strummed on banjos missing a string or three. And stories, oh the stories, kept the darkness at bay. Tales of haunted canyons, heroic prairie rescues, and, most fearsome of all, the ghost of Farmer Jeb, who ran out of firewood and manners. Yet, as the wind curled around corners and wolves howled politely in the distance, settlers clung to warmth where they could find it, in thick socks, hot drinks, and the company of their shivering, snoring kin. And just as the fire burned down to gentle embers and boots steamed quietly by the stove, another sound would rise softly in the background. Not the cry of wind, nor the chuckle of a neighbor, but something else entirely. The low, groaning creak of the sleigh. Yes, for with winter well underway, the question of transportation became its own bitterly amusing ordeal. As the chill deepened and the snow crept up to the window panes like frosty fingers hoping for a peek inside, one hard fact about life in the American frontier became abundantly and bitterly clear. These cabins, quaint as they appear in modern romance novels, were about as warm as a whisper in a blizzard. Imagine a settler's cabin in the dead of winter. The wind howls like a grumpy mule denied its supper, and the walls are made of logs so roughly fitted that daylight, and lately moonlight, slip straight through. Chinks were supposed to be filled with mud or clay daubing, but after a few good freezes and one overly inquisitive raccoon, entire hunks of insulation might have simply crumbled out. That's how a cozy evening by the fire often turned into a shivery game of guess which part of me has frostbite. Now, the fireplace, that iconic image of warmth and comfort, was more symbolic than functional. Most chimneys were made of stone or, heaven help them, mud-daubed wooden sticks in the earliest cabins. The design was usually generous in height, but tragically lacking in efficiency. A good gust down the flue, and you'd have a face full of soot and a living room mildly on fire. And with so much heat escaping through the wide-mouthed chimney, it was really just the part of the room within elbow's distance of the hearth that stayed warm. Everyone else. They layered on so many clothes, it was hard to tell where the human ended and the quilt began. Blankets were prized but rare. Quilts were more common, and often pieced together from scraps of worn-out clothing. Useful both as bedding and family heirlooms if they survived long enough. Featherbeds were a luxury as lofty as the clouds. Most folks stuffed mattresses with straw, which had one persistent issue. It poked, much like sleeping on an ambitious bundle of tiny swords. And come spring, the straw would be crawling with enough bugs to warrant their own census. As for heating the rest of the cabin, well, good luck. Boxes of hot embers from the main fire were sometimes carried to bed, cradled tenderly like sleepy kittens. Other times, people resorted to warming pans, metal pan-like objects filled with coals, slid between the sheets like a blazing invitation to comfort. Of course, sometimes these pans burned holes straight through the bedding, so that was another form of heat, emergency heat. But perhaps the quiet, unsung hero of keeping warm through the night wasn't fire or feather, but proximity. Yes, huddling was survival. Families often slept together under one quilt, children tucked in tightly between adults, like human kindling. Even the family dog, if you had one, might be welcomed onto the bed like a furry, flatulent furnace. Modesty took the winter off. Clothing wasn't so much changed during the cold months as it was, layered endlessly or simply worn until spring. Underthings, flannels, sometimes several sets at once, were all kept on at night. Some settlers admitted quite plainly that they never undressed entirely between November and March. As one old-timer once noted, changing clothes for warmth is like rearranging deck chairs in a snowstorm. One way or another, you're still cold. Children, being smaller and more slippery, sometimes wriggled away from these group sleeping formations in the night and had to be scooped up from icy corners like wayward sacks of potatoes. Parents quickly learned that stuffing the young ones into homemade sleep sacks, essentially woolen cocoons, reduced the number of frost-nipped toes and increased everyone's chance of cuddly survival. It wasn't all gloom and shivers, though. On the rare night when the fire crackled contentedly, tummies were full of stewed whatever, and the winds stayed outside where they belonged. There was almost a kind of peace. The father might whittle by candlelight, crafting spoons or toys out of stubborn hickory. The mother might quietly mend socks worn thin by frostbitten ambition. Children, half dozing and snuggled deep beneath quilts, would fall asleep to the murmuring sounds of their parents chatting about seed orders and tools yet needed come spring. And so the cabin, rattly and rough-edged, settled into sleep like a wooden creature breathing shallow breaths beneath its snow-laden roof. Just enough warmth, just enough hope. Some nights, while the walls creaked and the wind tugged like it wanted a turn inside, the settlers would close their eyes and dream not of sunshine or spring, but simply of being a little warmer than yesterday. Somewhere, beyond the walls and out in the snow-blind dark, a coyote sang his haunting tune. But inside, wrapped in threadbare quilts and layered flannels, the settlers found calm in the quiet tick of embers, the hush of settled snow, and the slow march toward morning. Now that we've tucked the family into their patchwork nest of warmth and togetherness, let's quietly lift the latch and step into what waited in the storeroom, where icy potatoes and questionable butter reflect the colder side of frontier cuisine. if you had asked a homesteader in 1873 what their top 3 concerns were, you might expect dramatic answers. War, robbers perhaps, a feared grizzly bear with a vendetta. But more often than not, they'd pause from waxing their mustache or sewing a patch onto a sleeve and sigh wearily. Chimneys, smoke, and socks. Let us linger then, in the gentle smoke of a winter hearth, in a home that leaned slightly to the left like it had a secret. The average settler's cabin was less rustic charm and more hastily nailed together in a fit of optimism. Walls of stacked logs sealed with chinking made from mud, straw, and wishful thinking. Come December, those gaps in the structure whispered cold secrets to the inside world. Inside, survival wasn't about brute strength or braving the blizzard bare-chested like a frontier Hercules. No, it was all about planning and socks. Hand-knit, sometimes mismatched, and worn in layers like flaky pastry, wool socks were revered valuables. A good pair could prevent frostbite, serve as an impromptu coffee filter, or even be gifted romantically as a show of affection. Historians agree, some early marriages were built entirely on well-darned hosiery. Ah yes, the hearth fire, glow of the gods. The wood-burning stove, small and sooty, was the center of warmth, cooking, drying, and even classroom lectures if someone happened to carve the alphabet into the stovepipe. Families would gather close, the warm side of their body rosy and the other side mildly concerned for its own well-being. This led to the invention of the pioneer pirouette, a subtle, slow-motion twirl you did every few minutes to avoid losing one side of your body to frost. Wood gathering was a winter ritual both exhausting and existential. Imagine trudging through thigh-high snow to find a dead tree, then stabbing it repeatedly with an axe while your beard gathered icicles and muttered things like, "Why didn't we move to California?" The logs were then hauled home by sled, wheelbarrow, or in emergencies, by children bribed with molasses taffy. And yet, despite the cold, oh, the glorious cold, settlers still insisted on tiny single-room cabins. Privacy, a myth. Luxury, unheard of. Everyone simply agreed to mumble apologies at night, when 5 of you were bundled together under buffalo hides and grandma's quilt, and someone let slip a chilly foot onto another's warm thigh. The most frequent prayer whispered between cracks in log walls was some variation of, "Please, Lord, may that not be the goat." Cabin evenings were long and slow. By lamplight or candle stub, settlers read from the family Bible, whether for devotion, distraction, or simply because it was the only book that hadn't been turned into emergency wallpaper. Children would trace the letters of Psalms with soot-smudged fingers, and grown-ups would share stories, some tall, some true, and some fabricated entirely to one-up the Johnsons next door, who claimed their rooster had defeated a bobcat once. Entertainment, after all, was homemade. Fiddle tunes were passed around, like pie. Someone, somewhere, was always learning to play, and doing so very publicly. Occasionally, a harmonica spirited forth, sometimes in tune, sometimes in defiance of tune. Knitting was another evening activity, a rhythmic, calming motion, interrupted only when someone accidentally knitted their project into the blanket beneath them. Supplies dwindled as the snow deepened. Flapjacks got thinner, stew meat got mysterious. Makeshift ingenuity bloomed like frost on a window pane. Candles were made of animal fat, known as tallow, and burned with all the aromatic grace of wet mittens. Soap became a negotiation. Do you want to smell nice, or do you want to have enough bacon fat left for the biscuits? Still, there was a camaraderie in shared hardship. Winter, unforgiving as it was, knitted neighbors together. One family might share firewood when another ran low. One would patch a neighbor's coat, while another shared the last of their honey. These small transactions of kindness became the invisible currency of survival. And while the wind howled against the wooden walls and snow curled around the doorframe like a curious cat, there was huddled warmth inside, in laughter, in stories retold for the 30th time, in the whispered promise of spring. Soon, as daylight lingers longer and the snow begins to melt in timid retreat, our pioneers must prepare to face not cold, but a different kind of trial. One involving sun, seeds, and the never-ending question of how to make things grow where everything seems determined not to. A hush blanketed the prairie, like a candle had been snuffed out in the sky. Winter nights in the west were not just cold, they were deeply quiet, like nature itself had curled up beneath 4 quilts and decided to wait it out until spring. But despite the silence, the cabins were rarely still. In the glow of a low-burning fire, feet shuffled in straw-stuffed moccasins. Kettles murmured on iron stoves, and page after dog-eared page of the family Bible received more attention than it had all summer. Now, before we get too enchanted by the idea of a toasty log cabin aglow with hearth fire, let's remember, many of these homes were slapdash affairs built with more determination than structural integrity. Insulation often involved whatever was handy: mud, moss, buffalo hair, or an optimistic arrangement of newspapers pasted between logs with homemade flour paste. If the Sears catalogue got drafted into duty, so be it. Reading about corsets and harrows could wait. Right now, the walls needed patching. At the heart of the home, quite literally, was the stove. Originally, many of these cabins had nothing more than a modest fireplace constructed of stone, which, while charmingly rustic, was about as efficient at heating a room as a sigh. By the mid-1800s, enterprising settlers began upgrading to cast iron wood-burning stoves, bulky, soot-covered, and usually named after distant cities. There were Dayton stoves, Albany stoves, and mysteriously, the superior comfort number 3. These metallic workhorses were the closest thing to indoor sunshine once the sun dipped away at 4:30 in the afternoon. But make no mistake, managing a stove wasn't leisure. It was more like an unpaid internship in thermodynamics. You needed the right kindling, a dry stack of firewood, permanent soot under your fingernails, and the reflexes to dodge the occasional belch of smoke. Add to that the daily existential question of whether it was worth getting out from under the covers to feed the fire at 3 a.m. when your toes had just reached that perfect degree of lukewarm, and you've got the full winter experience. Speaking of covers, the bedding situation in pioneer cabins was a feat of engineering. Feather ticks, mattress-like cloth bags stuffed with goose down, were treasured but scarce. More common were mattresses filled with corn husks, straw, or dried grasses, which sounded cozy until you remembered they were also the nesting materials of many small, hardy critters who didn't mind winter one bit. Quilts were critical, if not obsessive projects, sewn by flickering candlelight, and often patched with pieces from old shirts, apron corners, or mystery fabric presumed safe for human contact. At night, every available body, human, canine, feline, or otherwise, piled into the same sleeping space for warmth. It wasn't uncommon for families to sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, and woe unto the child who squirmed. The Great Foot War of 1873, as only slightly exaggerated in Aunt Clara's diary, began when young Tommy refused to surrender sleeping territory, and his brother retaliated with a sneak attack via cold toes. Clothing in winter was an exercise in layering, ingenuity, and sheer defiance. Wool was king. Not fancy gent walking his beagle wool, but prickly, scratchy, smells like sheep wool that took on the shape of whatever body part had worn it longest. Underclothes were long and often comically oversized, particularly when hand-me-downs so many times that no one could remember who had worn them first. Some children suspected their drawers might have debuted during the Mexican-American War. Venturing outside meant donning everything you owned, plus a buffalo robe if one was handy. If you didn't have one, you made do, sometimes sewing together flour sacks, or even repurposing leather harnesses into makeshift snow leggings. No one was winning fashion medals, but surviving the outhouse at midnight in minus 20 degrees was enough of a reward. Still, despite all this, winter gave settlers a rare gift: time. With the fields asleep and travel stalled, families could sit, stitch, sing, read, and rest together. Sometimes they listened to wind-wailing stories told by elders whose teeth no longer had the enthusiasm for salt pork. Sometimes they just listened to the house creak where the frost bit it. Tomorrow would bring more chores, another log to the stove, another layer added to the frost blossoming on the windows. But tonight, the fire hummed, quilts breathed softly, and stars blinked lazily in the vast winter sky. Out beyond the cabin walls, the night deepened, a dark so wide and calm, it almost felt like it was listening. And as the snow piled higher along the doorframe, someone inside the cabin whispered, "Spring sure seems like a long time from now." But just before sleep, there was a sound, soft but certain, the creak of a hinge. Someone wasn't quite ready to let go of the night. Somewhere between a snowflake's fall and the slow simmer of a rabbit stew, life on the frontier in winter moved with a rhythm all its own. And by rhythm, I mean mostly creaking floorboards, sneezes, and the occasional muffled cussing when a bucket of water froze overnight. Again, settlers didn't exactly thrive in the cold. They more or less tolerated it with gritted teeth and 17 layers of wool. The good news, they got very good at inventing new ways to stay warm. The bad news, those ways were usually itchy, awkward, or smelled faintly of old bacon. Let's begin with the great art of insulation. Today, the word brings to mind fiberglass or radiant heat panels, both of which did not exist in 1872 Nebraska. What did exist? Mud, also moss, animal hides, prairie grass, and even newspapers if one had such a luxury. Stuffing the cracks in the cabin was a community affair that often involved children shoving tufts of dry grass into chinks between logs while trying not to become part of the wall themselves. Blankets were a precious commodity, especially patchwork quilts handed down through generations like secret family recipes. Blankets weren't just for the bed. They were shawls, cloaks, baby bundlers, even makeshift room dividers when a little privacy was needed to take off your long johns in peace. Speaking of clothing, the fashion statements of frontier survival. Shirts were rarely washed, not out of laziness, but out of freezing practicality. Laundering in winter required breaking the ice on a stream, hauling water back to a tub you had to heat over a fire, and then hoping your shirt didn't just freeze into a shirt cycle while hanging. It was easier to just wear a shirt until it could walk off by itself, at which point someone would announce, "Well, Jed's flannel has achieved sentience. Time to boil it." Wool reigned supreme. Wool socks, wool mittens, wool hats so itchy, they developed their own reputation in community law. Everyone had one, usually knit by a relative who meant well, but didn't believe in loose stitches. Some hats were big enough to also act as face masks, which helped in blizzards, And if you think fashion was bad in winter, imagine living in a 2-room cabin with 7 people, all wearing the same 4 shades of brown. Now then, the fire. Oh, the noble fire. It was more than warmth. It was life, companionship, and the sole form of entertainment before jars of pickled vegetables started whispering from the pantry. The wood-burning stove stood like an iron deity in the middle of the main room. It cooked your food, dried your gloves, and gave you a place to hover around when frost crept through every crevice. Entire family gatherings happened around the stove. Children learned to read there. Parents dozed off while waiting for the beans to bubble. And occasionally, Uncle Cyrus burned his socks again because he liked them well done. But not everything was grim. Winter had its charms. Quiet moments after a snowfall when the world looked like a snow globe held its breath. There were snowshoe races around the outhouse and the hallowed ritual of making maple candy by drizzling syrup onto buckets of fresh snow. Not delicious by today's standards, perhaps, but after 3 straight nights of boiled turnips, it tasted like dessert sent by angels. And then there was the community. When you lived 3 miles from your nearest neighbor, winter visits became events of diplomatic importance. People arrived bundled like woolen armadillos, bearing gifts of eggs, bread, or news. The holy grail of frontier existence. Who left town? Who got ill? Who fell off their wagon and blamed the ice when really it was the whiskey? Even the dry goods store could seem like a social ball, especially if the owner let you huddle near his backroom stove and nibble on expired licorice. Mail delivery was sporadic but sacred. A letter from home could become a family heirloom, read out loud until the ink faded, the paper tore, and someone firmly insisted it was too special to use as kindling. Winter, in its own frozen way, built the backbone of frontier resilience. It forced settlers to lean on each other, often literally, when shoes were frozen solid and someone had to carry grandma across the yard. And as the frost painted delicate dreams on every window pane, and the wind howled outside like a coyote choir in rehearsal, cozy corners whispered promises of spring. Not soon, mind you, but eventually. Of course, when winter tightened its grip, even the bravest homesteader had reason to fear one thing above all: the morning chore of milking a cow who's been glaring at you since dawn. But that's a tale worth curling back up for. By December's arrival, the log cabins scattered across the American frontier had taken on the look of rough wooden ships moored in a frozen sea of snow. Crude, creaky vessels built not for elegance, but for endurance. Each home was a kind of personal fortress, 1 part lumber pile, 1 part soot collector, and entirely too small for a family of 7 crammed in with a goat, 2 chickens, and something in the corner nobody talked about, but everyone knew wasn't just firewood. Winter on the frontier was not for the delicate of spirit or the crisp of laundry. Laundry, incidentally, had gone into hibernation by late November. One did not wash flannel in a blizzard unless one had a particularly vengeful relationship with one's fingers. But while soap froze and boots grew personalities of their own, settlers had their own way of getting through the frostbitten days and the even longer nights. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the strange but rather charming winter ritual of storytelling. Once the daylight disappeared, at around what seemed like 2:30 in the afternoon, families would huddle near the fireplace, their only source of warmth and also, conveniently, their only light, and begin the great pastime of making things up. Frontier storytelling was humor, history, and complete hooey tangled into one braided yarn. You might hear Grandpa retelling the tale of the winter he fought off a pack of wolves with nothing but a soup ladle and his glare. Or Aunt Millie's recollection of the time a snowstorm trapped them in the cabin for 3 whole weeks, during which they invented 5 new uses for pickled beets, 4 songs about snow, and a board game known only as Don't Eat the Candle. These stories were hardly accurate, historians agree on that, but they were the social glue of isolated months and the duct tape of emotional survival. Children, wide-eyed and chilled, despite layers of itchy wool, would listen rapt, absorbing their family's mythologies along with the smoke of peat fires and the scent of unwashed moccasins. Meanwhile, the wind outside howled like a banshee with a scheduling conflict, making sure nobody forgot who was boss out there. If the fire died, you rebuilt it. If the cabin creaked, you assumed it wasn't ghosts. Probably. And if the roof started letting in snow again, someone would fetch the patch materials, which generally consisted of pine pitch, prayer, and whatever was left of the summer's tin plates. But not everything was make-do misery. Winter also had its small delights, often in the form of luxury food saved just for the season. Sugar, if it hadn't run out, and if you hadn't previously used it to bribe raccoons away from the root cellar, could go into snow taffy. Hot syrup poured over cold snow to make a sweet, sticky treat. It was both dessert and emergency dental test, depending on your bite strength. And then there were parlor games. Blind Man's Bluff was popular, though playing it in a 12-bev x12 room filled with furniture and livestock proved medically inadvisable. There was also Button Button, Who's Got the Button? A game with such low stakes and high repetition that one wondered if it was invented by someone who'd never actually seen a button, but liked the sound of the word. Still, when you stood by the frostbitten window, peering out at the white-covered plains and the skeleton fingers of trees reaching into the grey sky, something about the stillness wrapped around you like an old quilt. Time moved differently then, less like a train, more like a sled pulled gently across ice, creaking now and then, but mostly quiet. There was a comfort in that cold silence, a tender kind of patience the modern world seems to have forgotten. Inside, lantern light quivered on the walls, flickering over corn husk dolls and drying socks. The fire popped lazily, spitting tiny embers like sleepy fireflies. Someone snored softly, possibly the father, possibly the goat. And as the deep blue of night folded over the plains, those small, time-worn cabins seemed to pulse with a kind of shared resilience. They held the breath of generations, the mumblings of frontier philosophy, the echoes of songs invented out of boredom and kept alive out of affection. Soon enough, the dreams would come. Strange dreams, born of turnip stew and too much molasses. But for now, in the warmth of flickering flame and hushed winter quiet, the night unfolded like an old story retold once more by heart. With the wind still whispering to the wooden beams and snow sighing against the shutters, it's time we step outside just a moment to consider what those settlers ate when they weren't sugar rushing on ice candy. The cupboard doors, however reluctant, are ready to creak open. Outside the cabin walls, the world had hushed under a blanket of frost. Trees stood in silent ranks, their branches sugar-dusted and still. The wind whistled in private conversation with itself, weaving through cracks in the shuttered windows like a nosy ghost. Inside, though, there was the crackle of fire, the faint scent of boiled coffee, and the occasional symphony of someone trying to thaw their socks near the hearth without scorching them beyond recognition. Let's talk insulation, or, more accurately, its heroic absence. Frontier cabins weren't what you'd call up to code. Not unless your building inspector was a mule and your blueprint was stack logs until it feels like a home. The earliest Western settlers had to take what they could get, which often meant pine logs stacked horizontally, chinked together, with a paste resembling muddy wishes and straw. Every winter breeze found its way in like it had bought a ticket. The wind wasn't just a visitor, it was a roommate. To survive, pioneers got creative. Rugs, quilts, and animal hides weren't just for decoration. They were armored defenses against the kind of cold that encouraged even your nose to file for separation. Families pinned patchwork quilts over windows, hung buffalo skins over doors, and occasionally stuffed the cracks between logs with moss, old newspaper, or if desperate, last year's political pamphlets. Some methods were more successful than others. One family from Wyoming swore by hanging salted fish over their door to ward off both Arctic blasts and in-laws. Night times, oh, the long, long nights, were spent clustering together like spoons in a drawer. Beds weren't private affairs so much as communal heat experiments. You didn't just go to bed. You got in the human crockpot and hoped to wake up less frozen than when you went under. Children oftentimes nested together like puppies, limbs tangled and noses buried in someone else's armpit because warmth, and if someone snored, it was tolerated, even welcomed. It meant they were still alive. As for pajamas, they weren't slipping into something more comfortable, so much as refusing to remove the 3 layers of wool already glued to their persons. Frontier folk didn't bother with wardrobe changes overnight. You slept in what you wore during the day, which might include trousers, union suits, 2 pairs of socks, and, if it was especially frosty, the family dog. But perhaps nothing illustrates winter desperation more than the chamber pot. Yes, the unsung hero of nocturnal convenience, getting out of bed at 2 a.m. to answer nature's call through snow, over ice, and past whatever wolf-like sound that probably was, could result in frostbitten ambitions. So instead, a pot, tucked discreetly under the bed. It was a cherished luxury fare, more deserving of a thank you note than any Christmas present that year. And speaking of nocturnal terrors, creaks and groans weren't just the old house settling. Frontier cabins were notoriously vocal at night. Every gust made the timbers moan. Every knot in the wood whispered secrets. One Missouri homesteader wrote in his journal that his cabin complained louder than a mule with a pebble in its shoe. Whether it was the wind or an overfed raccoon on the roof, sleep was often interrupted by a polite moment of quiet panic. Yet, they got through it. The warmth of bodies, of fires, of shared stories and food cobbled together from salted pork and dwindling sacks of flour. Winter hibernation had a rhythm. Slow mornings, long evenings, and even longer games of checkers by lamplight, occasionally interrupted by a child accusing someone of cheating with a suspiciously lucky black king. To stay cozy, families leaned heavily on routine. Chores done early earned you the coveted seat nearest the hearth. Forget to take in wood before nightfall. Good luck. Enjoy sprinting outside in your boots and shame. Children were bribed with molasses treats, not because sugar was plentiful, but because sticky fingers meant they wouldn't touch anything else. So the settlers survived, wrapped in makeshift insulation and stubbornness, warmed by coffee, proximity, and more than a little well-earned irritation. They huddled together not just for heat, but for hope, hibernating through the dark like grumpy but determined squirrels. And as the cabin settled into another night, its fire crackling just loud enough to remind everyone it was still present, The wind continued to prowl along the eaves, but inside, the quiet hum of breath, coals, and dreams began to carry them forward, snow by snowflake, toward whatever waited with the warmth of sunrise. In the muffled hush of a snow-covered prairie, where the wind blew sideways and logic often froze solid by breakfast, one truth stood clear. If your socks weren't wool, your toes might never forgive you. Settlers in the American West, surrounded by nothing but pale sky and the whispering moan of winter, had to learn quickly that surviving in a log cabin wasn't about romantic frontier ruggedness. It was about figuring out how not to freeze to death before the kettle boiled. The cabins themselves, yes, the Western homesteader's pride, were often more symbolic than structural, built from whatever logs could be found, and sometimes vaguely shaped sticks that simply happened to be vertical. Many were single-room shelters that leaked more air than a paper kite. Chimneys, when they existed, preferred the term optional, and insulation was often a polite fiction settlers told themselves, while stuffing every crack with everything from moss to mail-order catalogues. By December, if you could see daylight through your back wall, congratulations, you had natural ventilation. And if not, then, if someone had actually finished the caulking before the snow came. A luxury. Keeping the cabin warm wasn't about raising the temperature. It was about slowing its descent into Arctic indifference. The fireplace, for example, roared like a lion, but only about half a foot in front of it. If you happened to be sitting on the opposite side of the room, say 6 feet away, you could either wait your turn or knit yourself a second torso. Settlers got creative. They buried hot stones in ashes during the evening and wrapped them in cloth to preheat the bedding. If you ever find yourself longing for the nostalgic comfort of a pioneer night, try sleeping beside a warm rock wrapped in burlap. Add the gentle creak of bending timber and a draft strong enough to flicker candlelight, and you're practically time traveling. To protect themselves overnight, families layered quilts like geological strata, sometimes piling on so many homemade blankets that rising from the bed in the morning required assistance from a pulley system, or, at the very least, strong familial encouragement. Nightwear was not the elegant flannel sleepwear we now associate with rustic sleep. No, winter sleepwear on the frontier was simply whatever combination of garments you weren't currently using to plug holes in the wall. Pioneer children often slept in their clothes, which is to say, they slept inside their own laundry pile. And then there were the ever-reliable hot irons, placed at the foot of the bed after being heated in the fire. These, wrapped in cloth, acted as crude bed warmers. Alas, heat was temporary and burns were forever, so one needed to strike a careful balance. Many a settler made the cozy transition from chillingly cold legs to slightly scorched ankles, and considered it a fair deal. Toileting, of course, was an adventure best avoided after dusk, with the outhouse half frozen and sometimes a good 50 yards away through waist-deep snow. Nature had to be kept waiting. Instead, many homes relied on the humble chamber pot, the unsung porcelain hero of the winter frontier. It was discreet, it was portable, and, if you happened to miss your footing during a sleepy midnight trip, a memorable experience in both sound and sensation. For settlers with livestock, nightly winter chores added another pinch of charm to the season. Leaving a warm-ish cabin to tramp through snowbanks and ensure that the chickens hadn't frozen into poultry popsicles required dedication, and ideally multiple pairs of socks. Milk cows protested the cold by producing less milk, chickens went on strike until spring, and horses simply huffed great clouds of disapproval into the moonlight. But, amid the shivering, there were flickers of warmth. Neighbours, when they could reach one another, shared food and stories. Quilting bees and barn dances were rescheduled indoors, often taking place in those barely 2 shovels-wide cabins, resulting in cheerful assemblies of elbows and bonnets, clattering spoons, and fiddles so out of tune they looped right back to charming. Winter nights were long and quiet, but also filled with whispered tales, communal hardship, and the kind of laughter that comes from mutual frostbite. These weren't just moments of survival, they were lessons in resilience stitched together like patchwork quilts. And somewhere, far off in the snowy silence, a kettle clattered softly against the edge of an iron stove, almost ready to boil, a sound like hope in a time of cracked lips and sleepy stoves. Next, we'll press deeper into the kitchen itself, the warm heart of cold homes, where ingenuity simmered beside lard, beans, and more than one questionable stew. As the wind outside howled like a forlorn coyote with a sore throat, the settlers turned inward, not just into their cabins, but into their imaginations. You see, there's only so long a person can stare at the snow piling up outside while chewing on the same salted pork chunk they've gnawed every evening for a fortnight before the mind starts to wander. And in the quiet hush of those snowbound nights, folk turned to storytelling. This was not the polished theatre of fancy cities back east. No velvet curtains, expensive playbills, or candlelit stages. This was porch theatre, stovetop soap opera, and fireside fantasy, all rolled into one. Stories swirled inside those log walls, some ancient, others invented moments before they were uttered. Most of them just wildly exaggerated truths, told by someone who likely hadn't spoken to another human in 12 hours. Every cabin had at least one, a talker, not a loud one. You want to keep things hushed during snowstorms, after all, in case the roof is feeling emotionally unstable. But a person who could string together tales fine enough to wind around your imagination like a sleeping quilt. Maybe it was Grandpa Amos, with his tale about wrestling a bear who'd wandered into the root cellar. Spoiler, alert, the bear won. Or maybe it was little Clara, just 9 years old, who spun a weekly saga about the tiniest mule in Montana. A mule who could travel unseen and ran secret missions for President Ulysses S. Grant. Storytelling padded the cold. It wrinkled time, making the hours between dusk and dawn seem shorter than they were. And they were long. Winter sunrises on the plains came in lazy and hungover, dragging their light across the frostbitten horizon like they, too, had heard one too many bedtime stories the night before. The best tales were often born from boredom and danger. You can thank near-death experiences for many a settler's greatest hits. A near miss with a mountain lion became a glamorous duel with a saber-toothed shadow panther. Getting turned around in a blizzard transformed into a brave solo expedition to chart a new trail. While, in truth, you were just trying to find the outhouse. Neighbours, if any were within earshot, traded stories like currency. If you told a good one, you were repaid with hot pie, fresh eggs, or, perhaps most trusted of all, an invitation to weather the winter storm by another hearth, where, of course, you'd be expected to repeat the same story verbatim, embellishments included. Occasionally, travelling peddlers and circuit preachers would bring news or the latest tall tales from distant settlements. These visitors were like Netflix dropping a surprise season. You never knew when they'd show up, but once they did, no one moved until the entertainment was through. And when the preacher was gone, well, you might catch someone in town performing a dramatic retelling of the sermon, complete with questionable accents. Even the long spells of silence, the moments between stories, warmed the soul in their own way. In those dry, creaking log cabins, silence was never absolute. There was the rhythmic tick of pine sap crackling in the fire, the distant groan of the wind past the shutters, and the soft shifting of wool blankets as someone tried to find that one warm spot. Of course, there were books, a treasured Bible, a tattered almanac if you were lucky, maybe a dog-eared volume of poetry that had survived 3 moves west, and one unfortunate drop in a puddle that froze mid-page. Families would gather around as someone read aloud, voices low and deliberate, like casting a spell to summon spring just a bit sooner. And when even stories grew thin, when the candle stubs gave out and the fire settled to soft red embers, dreams took over. Equal parts memory and imagination, they carried the settlers gently until the morning light cracked over the plains, revealing the same snow-covered world, maybe just a little quieter than before. Just beyond the walls of those worn-out cabins, winter was still running its long, slow campaign. And if storytelling was the settlers' strategy for survival, then games, yes, games, were their secret weapon for sanity, a flicker of mischief in the midst of frost. But that's a tale best saved for another firelight. Somewhere in the windswept stillness of midwinter, out where the stars blinked like frozen embers above pine-draped hills, settlement cabins became small islands of life in a sea of snow. And inside them, well, people did the eternal dance that humans everywhere have done when faced with the cold. They huddled, layered, muttered about socks, and tried not to freeze to death. The old-timers had tricks, good ones, dangerous ones, occasionally hilarious ones. One such example was the legendary galvanized tub sauna, which sounds more glamorous than it was. Most homesteaders didn't have a proper bathtub, so when winter reached its full ferocity, a large tin was hauled into the center of the cabin, right in front of the fire, if possible. Water was boiled in batches, carried over with great ceremony, and poured in. And then the family took turns, in descending age or ascending shame, depending on local customs and the amount of privacy afforded by a tacked-up blanket. These baths were luxurious, steamy events that briefly convinced participants they had defeated the mighty cold, until they stepped out, at which point their damp hair would freeze in new and exciting ways, and they'd realize their worn woolen socks had gone mysteriously missing again. There was also the fine art of layering. Pioneer garments were not only prized for warmth, but for their sheer entertainment value. Children were often so swaddled in homespun wool, flour sacks, and reworked quilts that they achieved a kind of sartorial immobility, arms sticking straight out as they waddled through snowbanks like particularly determined sandwich loaves. Mothers and grandmothers, meanwhile, engaged in a never-ending campaign of mending, knitting, and whispering worriedly over worn mittens, sock holes, and the mysterious disappearance of that one flannel nightshirt everyone swore had been on the hook last week. And then, there were the foot warmers, an entire chapter in human creativity dedicated to avoiding the bone-deep chill of rustic flooring. Flat irons wrapped in cloth, hot bricks pulled from the hearth, and baked potatoes, yes, baked potatoes, useful and delicious, were tucked into beds to warm toes before sleep. At community gatherings, folks were known to carry them under coats and shawls like secret edible hand warmers. It's rumored more than one courtship began over an offered spud at a snowbound church social. But perhaps the most underestimated weapon in the settler arsenal was storytelling. Flaming tales told by flickering lantern light, crafted to warm the spirit, if not the feet. Fathers told of wolves in the woods. Grandfathers reminisced about blizzards survived on pure grit and cornbread, while mothers could spin a simple lost mitten into a thrilling saga involving frostbite, perseverance, and usually some sort of positively behaved mouse. Children, meanwhile, mastered the art of collecting snow through every conceivable hole in their boots. By dawn, they could be found hanging upside down near the stove, drying socks and whispering elaborate tales of snowball ambushes and frost giants. Every child knew one cardinal rule: never remove both boots at the same time. That was how chaos started. As for meals during these icy months, they tended to become rather repetitive. Salt pork, beans, and whatever root vegetables hadn't gone squishy in the cellar starred heavily on the menu. Occasionally, someone would have the stroke of genius to sprinkle in a bit of dried apple, leftover molasses, or, heaven help us, actual pepper. These were high culinary moments. People still wrote about them in letters home, in lines like, "Art something with flavor, am reborn." Winter commerce didn't stop entirely though. Resourceful traders strapped wooden runners to carts and created sled-style snow wagons. Pulled by horses wrapped in burlap and good intentions, they'd clatter into town with sleigh bells and a surly attitude, offering tins of coffee, bricks of tea, sewing needles, and on one memorable occasion, an expired harmonica. But if life was tough outside, it was tender within. Families slept in heaps, shared one bed if needed, or when not needed but very cold. Babies were wrapped like papooses, tucked between siblings who grumbled at first and then clung to each other in sleepy warmth. And late into the night, with lanterns extinguished and only the moan of wind for company, someone might hum an old song, soft and slow, barely heard above the creak of the cabin walls. Often, that tune would meander into dreams, where the snow couldn't quite reach, and summer existed somewhere just beyond memory. Of course, while everyone tried their best to sleep through winter's bite, one small whiskered creature was wide awake and truly thriving near the cabin hearth. The mouse, industrious, tireless, and apparently able to knit mittens out of sheer willpower. But about that mouse, that will take us somewhere a little more peculiar next. The Wind was a full-time employee on the frontier, working overtime in the winter months with absolutely no benefits and a knack for finding the tiniest cracks in the cabin wall. And somehow, the smaller the crack, the more the Wind wanted to slip through it, like a nosy neighbor who wouldn't take the hint and just stay outside. Inside those creaky cabins, the prime source of warmth wasn't necessarily the fire, it was proximity. People to fire proximity, people to people proximity. In some cases, dog to everyone proximity. It got so cold, folks often let chickens roost inside with them, which sounds charming until you've been woken at 3 a.m. by an ambitious hen convinced it's dawn, and you're late milking the non-existent cow. Settlers didn't just survive the winters. They orchestrated entire routines around simply not freezing into human-shaped icicles. They went to bed early, partly because it was dark and partly because it was warmer under 3 quilts, 2 dogs, and a cousin than it was doing literally anything else. Those quilts, by the way, weren't just for show. They were thick, practical, and often made out of everything short of chainmail. Old shirts, threadbare dresses, even the odd sackcloth with a suspiciously floral pattern. Nothing was off limits when you were trying to keep toes attached through February. Quilting bees were social events during warmer months, where folks would gather to stitch, swap gossip, and politely one-up each other's patchwork skills. It was essentially the Facebook of its day, only quieter and with more molasses cookies. To make the most of the dwindling daylight, settlers adopted what you might call extreme coziness rituals. There was the ceremonial boiling of things, anything really. Beans, water, leather shoes if things got desperate, and the pouring of this precious warmth into stone or metal bottles, which were then tucked into beds before anyone dared to slide beneath the covers. It was a simpler, slightly more medieval version of an electric blanket, only heavier, and probably smelled faintly of supper. Children, lucky little thermal units that they were, often got tasked with warming the bed. Not in any metaphorical sense, just in the literal, slightly unfair one. They'd be sent ahead to lie in the freezing sheets like tiny, shivering pioneers, softening the ice-cold linens for the adults who'd amble in later under the guise of checking the fire. One great irony of the frontier winter was the complete disappearance of privacy. Once the cabin door was shut, daily life collapsed into one shared space. Mum stirred the beans as Pa darned socks. Little Mary practiced spelling while Grandma occasionally muttered at the fire like it owed her money. And all the while, everyone pretended that the chamber pot in the corner was completely invisible and just part of the rustic decor. To keep spirits buoyed, many settlers turned to storytelling, tales told by flickering lamplight, filtered through layers of memory and creative license. They spoke of near mythic figures, mountain men who ate bark and survived, kindly native traders who could read the stars, and that one woman down the creek who baked bread that actually rose, even in the cold. Legends, the lot of them. The act of storytelling was not just entertainment, it was insulation. A way to layer your psyche against isolation, to keep the soul warm when the wind gusted so hard it seemed like even the moon was shivering. Music, too, played its part. Fiddles came out when fingers weren't too frozen to hold the bow. Harmonicas were passed around like communal dreams, each note rising in the candlelit air like a soft protest against the night. Sometimes, if you listened closely through the snow-dampened windows, you could catch a single, haunting voice humming an old ballad while stirring porridge, keeping time with the wooden spoon. Of course, not every tune was melancholic. Some were downright rowdy, frontier-style dance tunes, stomped out on wooden floors by socked feet and cracked boots, shaking dust from the rafters, and possibly terrifying the family goat tied up just inside the door. Sure, the harsh cold could crack your lips, freeze your nostrils, and make your eyebrows feel like they belonged to someone else. But inside, behind thick walls dappled with frost, laughter rose. Humans, after all, are a stubborn bunch, and when the snow falls heavy and the night presses close, we push closer still, into light, into warmth, and quite often, into each other's armpits. And so, a cabin in winter was more than timber and nails. It was a hearth-bound world stitched together with homemade socks, communal stories, and just the right number of potatoes tucked under the bed to keep from freezing. Somewhere beyond the frosted logs and the howling wind, the snow kept falling. But inside was another tale waiting to unfold, perhaps one that had something to do with snowshoes and the misadventures that came from pretending they were easy to walk in. Though the wind outside howled through the cottonwoods like a pack of wolves with a flair for the theatrical, inside the cabin, life carried on in its curious winter rhythm. The settler family, Ma, Pa, the kids, and occasionally Old Man Jenkins, who simply refused to go back to his own cabin, settled into rituals that blurred the line between survival and something almost resembling coziness. You might assume that with no central heating, double-pane windows, or fleece-lined socks from a well-advertised internet company, settlers would just freeze like longhorn icicles. But no, these were resourceful souls, with the combined stubbornness of mules and the creative desperation of people who had left everything behind for a future that included, but was not, limited to, frostbite. The fireplace was the undisputed star of the winter months. Not just a place to cook or warm fingers numb from hauling in water, it became the beating heart of the cabin, crackling, popping, and occasionally spitting hot embers, like it had strong feelings on politics. Everyone gathered around it in layers that would confuse an archaeologist. Flannels, wool, deer hides, and on rough days, quilts tied about the shoulders like makeshift capes. Beds became communal affairs. Not in the modern romantic sense, but more in the we are all trying to not become human popsicles sense. Children, dogs, and the occasional ill-tempered cat were bundled together under so many blankets the bottom occupant could vanish entirely. Privacy was traded for warmth, and complaints about smelly feet were gently silenced in favor of circulation. Settlers also showed a peculiar affection for bricks. Yes, bricks. They'd warm them by the fire and tuck them into beds, baskets, or even wrap one in cloth and cradle it like a grumpy baby just before slipping it under the covers. There's nothing quite as humbling as depending on a hot stone to keep your toes attached. Clothing etiquette relaxed dramatically. Ma would usually insist on civility, but come January, not even she could find fault with a child who wore 3 pairs of socks, none matching, and had developed a lifestyle that revolved around not taking their boots off unless absolutely necessary. In fact, there existed a certain badge of honor in not having come out of these flannels since the first freeze, shared in whispers like frontier war stories. It wasn't just warmth that needed preserving, it was morale, which is where the curious creatures called corn husk dolls came in. With no toy stores, and children who couldn't entertain themselves solely with vague existential dread, like modern adults, idle evenings were filled with twisting husks of corn into humanish shapes. Some had names, elaborate personalities, and very strong opinions on how cornbread should be prepared. Others were less realistic, resembling abstract ghosts or very confused mop heads. But the kids adored them just the same. Music helped. Fiddles, harmonicas, and the occasional jaw harp brought cheer that ricocheted off the cabin walls. One didn't need to be good, just enthusiastic. And boy, were they. You haven't known joy until you've watched a 3-year-old in a hand-sewn gown spin deliriously to a half-forgotten tune, while the firelight flickers on a nearby jug of molasses. Evenings were for storytelling. Tall tales ran rampant, especially when snow-trapped travelers and mouths had nothing better to do than generate folklore. By the flicker of candle or lantern light, listeners would hear of a cousin who once rode a bear, or a woman up in the Dakotas who could knit mittens so fast the yarn never cooled. True, absolutely not. Entertaining, like coffee on a cold morning. As the wind rattled the shutters and the night stretched long, life inside the cabin slowed to a gentle murmur. Whispers under quilts, Pa poking at the fire with a poker that had been a pitchfork in a previous life, and the hissing of a pot of beans on the hearth. Time unraveled softly. Old Man Jenkins, of course, declared the floor warmer than his own cot. Ma didn't argue. She simply stepped over him like a well-dressed log and handed him another blanket. Outside, the snow kept its patient watch, piling in slow flurries on log roofs and along fence posts, painting the world pale and still. But indoors, hearts remained stubbornly alight with laughter, warmth, and hope, insulated not just by logs and quilts, but by the timeless determination to carry on, one long winter night at a time. And so, with the fire crackling low and the wind carrying stories through the brittle grass, we gently turn our gaze toward the humble meals that kept bellies and spirits full through these frozen months. The bitter wind didn't knock, it barged in. Through every knothole and drafty corner of a settler's cabin, winter in the west made its entrance less like an invited guest and more like a surly in-law with an axe to grind. And the cabins, their log walls stacked with more optimism than insulation, were no match for the frigid frontier air. If the wind didn't nip your nose, the cold floorboards finished the job. You didn't walk barefoot inside during winter unless you had unresolved grievances with your toes. Many settlers hunkered down in these single-room homes, fashioned from whatever trees hadn't objected too vigorously to being chopped. Pine was popular, but mostly because it didn't run away. The roofs, if we're being generous with the term, were made of overlapping planks, sometimes covered with sod. Snow gathering atop them like a sleep-deprived baker piling too much powdered sugar onto a cake. When warmth was needed most, it leaked out like a scandal at Sunday church. The fire, naturally, was the holy altar of winter survival. A well-built hearth was the heart of every home, even if half the time it smoked like an over-dramatic actor leaving the stage. Firewood had to be chopped, stacked, and guarded like precious treasure, because nothing inspired true Western drama quite like the realization at dusk that there was only one log left and 5 people shivering. And so, during those long, frozen nights, settlers got creative. They wore everything they owned, often all at once. It was entirely common for someone to sleep with their coat, scarf, mittens, and a hat that looked like it had been borrowed from a defeated bear. Quilts were layered in such quantities that moving beneath them required a feat of strength, teamwork, or divine intervention. And yet, it wasn't unusual to wake with your breath condensing in front of your face, as if your soul was politely reminding you to maybe consider hibernation. Salt pork and beans remained stoically on the winter menu, largely because they didn't go bad, though scientists today wonder if they ever really qualified as good. Thanks to freezing temperatures, the root cellar became more freezer than pantry, and anything left too close to the walls developed a chill firm enough to crack a molar. The windows, if you were lucky enough to have one, were grand masters of frost art. Elaborate, frilly designs would bloom across the glass, unintentionally transforming every cabin into a haunted dollhouse of icy lace. Most windows were patched with oiled paper or cloth, a technique that filtered the light, while politely ignoring your basic need for sunlight and dignity. Now, if you had livestock, you didn't just worry about feeding them. You worried about waking up to find your prize cow frozen to the trough. Some settlers even brought smaller animals inside, chickens, piglets, and on especially chilly nights, goats with boundary issues. It was like hosting a sleepover where everyone expected dry hay, constant snacks, and the right to pee wherever they pleased. Entertainment in these frosty months was a relative term. Reading, if you had books, was a popular option, though reading anything printed in that era came with a 30% chance of encountering ye old unnecessary vowels. Music helped too, with fiddles and harmonicas playing tunes worn smooth from repetition. Families would sit close, shoulder to shoulder, as stories were passed down, spun new, or just slightly exaggerated, like the one about a cousin who once fended off a pack of wolves with only a soup ladle and poor social skills. For children, winter games took place mostly indoors, like button-spinning contests, improvised puppet shows, or arguments over nothing that could last 2 to 3 business days. The most thrilling game, however, was who gets closest to the fire without spontaneously combusting. A serious matter, considering frostbite had aspirations of being tomorrow's guest star. But despite all the discomfort, something strange and rather beautiful happened during those long winters. Settlers weren't just cooped-up survivors in cabins. They were families bound by flickering firelight, woven into stories that creaked along the rafters. They grew closer in the cold, learned patience amid scarcity, and came to recognize resilience as something more than just a big word in the Bible. Outside, the wind continued to howl like a lonesome coyote at a poetry slam. But inside, another log was added to the fire, a wool sock patched, a quilt straightened, and somewhere a kettle began to hum. And so, as the frost whispered against the window pane and the night carried on with its gentle hush, another thought took root, as steady as snowfall. Not all warmth comes from fire. Of course, tomorrow would bring its own challenges, or perhaps a surprise in the powdery snow. But that, as you might imagine, is another tale to unfold beneath the settling hush of winter silence. If you've ever gazed out at a soft, snowy night and wondered how people survive such winters without central heating or a Costco-sized jar of cocoa mix, well, let's talk about hot water bottles. Specifically, what passed for one on the squinting edge of the frontier. Yes, the great innovation of the Western winter wasn't just cabins, wool socks, or disdain for wind. It was heated things placed next to sleeping humans. Now, in the romantic retellings, perhaps you imagine settlers clutching gingerly stitched flannel pouches of boiling water, warmed by the fire and tucked neatly inside carefully mended bedsheets. But allow me to gently correct any illusions. The truth, much like the cornbread, was rough around the edges. In the long and unyielding darkness of pioneer nights, folks often slept beside whatever had retained heat from the hearth. This included, and is not limited to, cast iron skillets, flat stones, bricks, strange metal, contraptions that are hard to describe and impossible to patent, and in at least one documented case, a half-warmed badger. That'd be Ezekiel Dunn's family. Nobody asked him to do it, but nobody stopped him either. A classic favorite, though, was the brick. Carried lovingly from the fire, wrapped in burlap to prevent foot burns, and slid gingerly under the covers. There was always an art to it. Too hot, and you'd end up with a toasty thigh and a cautionary tale. Too cool, and you'd basically invited a square, dusty ice cube into your cot. In some slightly better supplied households, settlers had what were called warming pans, long-handled metal pans filled with hot coals, meant to be placed under the sheets for a few minutes to eliminate the feeling of crawling into a glacier. As with most uses of fire in the 1800s, this was cozy in theory and a complete insurance liability in practice, if insurance had been a thing. One Kansas woman, Eliza Markham, reportedly devised a clever alternative: heated sand in a woolen sack. According to her diary, she was alarmed less by the cold and more by my neighbor's embers scorching clean through their feather bed. Eliza, it seems, favored innovation over incident reports. Now, if you had the luxury, and by luxury, I mean an animal indoors, you might have made use of beastly body heat. Dogs were treasured companions not just for guarding the chickens, but for serving as foot warmers. The phrase "three-dog night" is more than clever wordplay. It described just how many dogs you needed in bed to survive a cold night. Fewer than 3, and you'd better be wearing all your clothes plus half the laundry line. Children also played pivotal roles in heat dispersion. In many families, it was common to pack younger kids in the middle of shared beds, like little sausage links of warmth. Elders and teenagers took the edge, both metaphorically and temperature-wise. Some young siblings even had games about who could sneak to the warm spot the fastest, which mostly ended in minor frostbite and major tattling. Mothers, ever resourceful, sometimes layered bedding with every available fabric: quilts, curtains, unripped horse blankets, and the occasional last year's election poster would find themselves stitched into monstrous but effective patchwork comforters. The irony, of course, is that making such a quilt in the 19th century often took longer than surviving the actual winter. Let's not forget the uncanny ability of some settlers to conjure heat from hot drinks so strong they doubled as varnish remover. Out on the Missouri plains, it was common for folks to sip a concoction called calico coffee, which contained no beans, but rather scorched cornmeal or roasted chicory, brewed to the consistency of boot polish and regarded medically as better than freezing. Still, despite the ingenuity or questionable beverage choices, an unrelenting truth remained. No matter how many bricks you packed, dogs you cuddled, or layers you wore, the Wild West night had a way of reminding you who was boss. Nature, unbothered and unblanketed, swept over the Great Plains with a touch both majestic and mildly vengeful. Yet in those dim, blanket-fortified rooms, around glowing embers and cuddled kin, there was a kind of stubborn harmony, a willingness to get through it, one warm rock at a time. The morning might be bitter, the fire might need hours to coax back from its ashes, but there, in the dusky quiet of midnight, surrounded by brick-warm toes and siblings who snored like oxen, the settlers held fast. And in the hush before dawn, there were other small comforts one could rely on, like the sound of salted meat crackling from the hearth, or the faint, blessed promise of a skillet full of something hot, which we'll take a closer look at soon, when the breakfast bell rings across a very chilly prairie. In the deep lull of a western winter, when the snow past your knees and the wind found the exact seam in your coat you forgot to patch, there remained one secret weapon in a settler's survival kit: hospitality. Now, be warned, this was not the embroidered doily, lace tablecloth type of hospitality. No. This was survival-grade, stew-sharing, you snore you stay kind of hospitality. Folks in the frontier didn't open their doors because they had time for polite conversation. They did it because if they didn't, somebody might freeze nose first on the porch. Imagine a blizzard so thick you can't see your own boots, and in the distance, through the swirling white, a soft yellow glow peeks from a cabin window. That warm light wasn't just a flame, it was hope. The fireplace inside might not have had much wood, and the stew might have been one potato waving politely at 6 cups of hot water. But if you came knocking, you were coming in. It's here that the term passing through was both literal and illusory. A stranger might arrive a guest and leave a godparent. Frontier bonds formed quickly, perhaps because nobody wanted to spend more than 8 seconds alone with their own thoughts in the dark. Even the most hardened trail riders, who once claimed the only travel companion they trusted was their shadow, would melt into the warmth of a hearth offered by a stranger who had the decency to own at least one extra wool blanket. Hospitality, you see, wasn't just about kindness. It was a system, an unspoken code of the stove. When news of an incoming storm traveled by horse, hat tip, and 4-day delay, it was understood that wherever you found yourself, you made room. And not just room, but emotional space too. Sharing was the name of the game. Beds, bread, beans, and even stories blurted out in the middle of the night when the windows moaned like haunted harmonicas. These tales, often tall enough to scrape snow off the roof, drifted around the fire. There was always some fellow who swore he once wrestled a cougar to get back his dinner spoon. It seemed every guest had met someone who'd once ridden their mule into a church mid-sermon just to warm their extremities. Fortunately for all involved, the mule was the better listener. Homespun homes passed through these sagas like recurring characters in an improvised soap opera. Oh yes, one host might muse, chewing thoughtfully on bread so hard it doubled as roofing material. Old Sally up north, she takes in travellers near the pass, keeps a quilt that could cover a barn. And sure enough, if you stumbled half-frozen into Sally's place, you'd find the quilt, the barn vibes, and probably 3 other half-thawed guests politely elbowing each other for space near the stove. And yet, for all the warmth extended, visitors still followed certain delicate etiquettes, unspoken rules. For instance, you absolutely positively did not ask what mystery meat was in the stew, if it crunched a little too much or tasted suspiciously like old boots. Well, boots were made of leather, and leather is cow, and cows are food, and here we are. It was also considered terribly rude to complain about drafty cabins. Everyone knew they were drafty. The cabins were built in 8 days by exhausted people with frostbite and often only one functional hammer between them. You don't critique the architecture after you've used their chamber pot. And of course, when morning came and the snow still held the world in its icy grip, guests might accidentally linger, helping to chop wood, mend fences, or discreetly break into tears over breakfast just to buy another night's invitation. The hosts rarely protested. They simply poured more coffee, the kind that could etch your teeth, and slid over a cracked mug without breaking eye contact. Some even insisted you stay, mainly because, as it turns out, chopping logs in winter is just slightly less unpleasant than stirring soup with a frostbitten hand. So, in the flicker of freezing days and firelit nights, a unique kind of neighborliness bloomed, the kind where survival wasn't individual but communal, hospitable, homemade, slightly underseasoned perhaps, but heartfelt all the same. And on nights when the wind howled like a lonesome dog and the snow pressed in tight around the cabin walls, that shared warmth, physical and otherwise, was more valuable than gold, or at least more valuable than those coins you couldn't spend anywhere because the general store had blown half a county over last week. In the next hush of the winter wind, we'll settle deeper into the heart of the cabin, where shadows stretch across creaky floorboards and where settlers found something as rare as a warm bath, a sense of peace. While the wind howled outside and snow heaped against the shutters like a dog desperate to come in, the inside of many frontier cabins became theatres for the season's real spectacle, a comedy of survival that unfolded in layers of wool, smoke, and mild marital bickering. Let's imagine you're a settler in the mid-1800s, cozied in a one-room cabin somewhere in the Dakota Territory. The fire is crackling, romantic, but mostly because it's evaporating the layer of ice off your nose. The stew smells kind of delicious, but you're not entirely sure if it's rabbit or last month's possum leftovers. Doesn't really matter. At this stage of winter, flavor was a suggestion more than a certainty. Now, while winter outside roared like a Shakespearean villain, life indoors became a masterclass in compromise. Space, for instance, was at a premium. Most cabins were 10 by 12 feet, about the size of a modestly ambitious walk-in closet. In that single room, you'd have a bed, if you were lucky, or a ticking straw mattress laid over old crates and prayerful optimism. There wasn't much privacy. Your snoring cousin. He was 3 feet away. The baby, also 3 feet away. Your romantic life, trapped in a snowbank somewhere near the outhouse. For entertainment, settlers got creative. Children played games like Button Button, Who's Got the Button, or Let's Freeze Our Toes Off on Purpose. Cards were popular until someone lost too many matches gambling and refused to go chop more wood. Then there were yarn-spinning sessions, in both senses of the word, actual spinning wheels, and the fine art of telling increasingly unbelievable stories. This was less about passing the time and more about staying mentally intact, because there's only so long one can stare at a cabin wall before the wood seems to blink back. Food also entered a peculiar dimension in winter. Root vegetables like turnips and potatoes lasted a while, though enthusiasm for them did not. By February, many settlers were far too familiar with the texture of pickled cabbage and the personality of old beans. Meat was dried, salted, or smoked, preserved with the general subtlety of being dipped in the sea and left in the sun. Still, necessity invented delicacies. If a stash of apples had been carefully stored in the root cellar, wrapped in paper and cocooned away from frost, they'd be doled out like bars of gold. A single, slightly shriveled apple could provoke a table-wide debate. Pie, jelly, or just stare at it reverently. And let us not forget the challenge of heating. The cabins were usually warmed by one small fireplace or iron stove, the kind that could toast your socks on one side and leave your back resembling a snow angel. Wood cutting was a year-round job, but in winter, the pile vanished faster than good manners at a barn dance. The phrase, "Don't use too much wood," was muttered more than, "I love you." To save heat, people would often sleep in shifts with the livestock. Cows, pigs, and chickens became unlikely hot water bottles. Chickens, to their credit, were silent partners in the deal. Cows, not so much. And pigs, well, let's just say it's hard to feel majestic while snuggling a pig named Dolores, whose snoring rivals the stove. But beyond the complaints and the cold feet, shared hardship had its perks. Family bonds, for better or worse, tended to strengthen. There were great laughs over small things. The absurd choreography of trying to dress under 17 layers of clothing. The daily argument over whose turn it was to fetch snow for melting. The quiet, mutual understanding that if one more cup of weak dandelion tea was served, somebody might snap. Survival meant more than fending off frostbite. It meant carrying each other through snowdrifts and sour moods alike. It meant storytelling and song singing, and the kind of laughter that holds hands with desperation and makes peace with it. Outside, the plains lay quiet and frozen, blanketed in stillness. But in these tight little cabins, hearts beat loud and warm. People hung lanterns in the windows, a soft glow offering a wordless reassurance to any traveler, lost in the whiteness. There's warmth here, if you can find your way. And speaking of finding your way, next, we'll gently slip into the forgotten tools and little winter tricks that settlers swore by, some clever, some questionable, and a few that involved questionable animal fats. Just after twilight slipped her velvet shawl over the prairie sky, life inside a settler's cabin began its nightly descent into quiet routine. It was a world ruled less by clocks than by candles and creaking floorboards, by the dry crackle of firewood and the occasional off-key lullaby sung to a fussy toddler wrapped in wool scratchier than a barn cat's tongue. After the chores had finally ended, insofar as chores ever truly ended, settler families would gather in their one-room cabins, each person carrying the day's weariness like an honorary badge of survival. Meals had been scraped together from flour, lard, and pure hope, and now came what might actually have been the most treasured time of day, sitting very, very still. Evenings in the Old West weren't just for rest. They were opportunities to engage in humble, low-tech entertainment. There was storytelling, of course, provided you weren't seated next to Uncle Amos, whose tales invariably involved lost boots, angry chickens, and a German shepherd named Karl, who was neither German nor a shepherd, but fiercely loyal all the same. Books were prized possessions. If a family had even one, it was cared for like a mystical object, read slowly, relished, and possibly wrapped in cloth as tenderly as a swaddled baby. The Bible took top billing, but every now and again, a treasured novel would circulate among multiple cabins. Chapters would be read aloud on special nights, voices hushed, as if Laura Ingalls herself were listening in from the rafters. Musical instruments, when available, transformed cabins into miniature concert halls. Fiddles were the rock stars of the frontier. That nasal zing of bow on string could summon smiles faster than a pot of stew. And if no fiddle could be found, a harmonica, a homemade drum, or a kitchen spoon played against a washboard would more than suffice. There was no stage, you see, just open space near the hearth, where even toddlers with unruly rhythm could join in. Quilting also made its evening debut here. With their nimble fingers and keen sense of symmetry, women stitched together more than just cloth scraps. They catalogued warmth, legacy, and hope, carefully threading storylines into every geometric petal and patterned patch. Some quilts told family history, others simply said, "We survived another frost, hooray for us." Children, of course, were tucked in early, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with all the resistance of a cactus being hugged. Beds were communal affairs. Siblings piled together beneath thick layers of wool, worn flannel, and the occasional itchy surprise from a forgotten straw tick. Their lullabies were often inherited from distant lands, Scots lullabies, Irish airs, or German folk tunes. But sometimes children drifted off to the humming of the wind through the chinks in the log walls, or to the muffled crunch of snow falling from the roof in the moonlight. And let's not forget, on truly frigid nights, hot stones would be wrapped in cloth and slipped into beds as rustic hot water bottles. More than one settler child fell asleep hugging a rock, only to wake slightly perplexed and very warm, dreaming perhaps of dragons or potatoes, any warmth-associated imagery that might visit in slumber. Adults didn't so much go to sleep as surrender to it. Aches, bruises, and frozen toes conspired to lull even the most anxious minds into unconsciousness. Dreams came heavy, seasoned with soot and stew, punctuated by the occasional nightmare wherein the cow learned how to open gates or the soup pot ran off with the bread knife. Still, there was something sacred about those quiet, firelit hours. No whirring machines, no street lights, only the gentle crackling of logs and the distant howl of a lonesome coyote composing his unsolicited night opera. If the moon was bright enough to peek through frost-rimed windows, it might catch sight of a mother leaning over her children, adjusting tucked-in corners, brushing away a wayward curl, ensuring warmth before retreating to her fraction of a shared straw mattress. Outside, snow blanketed the world in patient silence, covering boot tracks, chilled fences, and the stubborn woodpile no one wanted to fetch from. Inside, life condensed into shared breath and quiet fortitude. And perhaps, before drifting into a sleep as solid as the log walls themselves, each settler would know, in some quiet nook of the heart, that surviving winter wasn't just about endurance. It was about rhythm, ritual, and just enough joy to see you through the frost. And speaking of rhythm, our next stop gently explores the strange and wonderful art of wintertime cooking, where frozen beans met cast iron dreams, and every disastrous stew was an edible adventure of sorts. As winter curled its icy fingers around the prairie, and the wind played a mournful tune through the pine slats of a one-room shack, Western settlers reached for the ultimate source of frontier comfort, food preservation methods so creative they could have doubled as science experiments, or elaborate pranks on the taste buds. But desperate times, as they say, call for pickled cabbage. Now, before modern refrigeration and Uber Eats, preserving food wasn't a Pinterest hobby. It was the fine, frostbitten line between nourishment and gnawing on regret. Settlers had to prepare during summer and fall with the same urgency a squirrel brings to hoarding acorns, or your neighbor racing for the last can of beans before a snowstorm. One favorite frontier method of preservation was root cellaring. Essentially, this meant digging a hole in the ground and putting vegetables in it, which might sound like where vegetables go to die, but actually, it was rather clever. Earth maintains a fairly constant temperature underground, and with a sprinkle of straw and a prayer or two, carrots, potatoes, and turnips could last through the worst blizzards. Root cellars range from full underground rooms to a pit hastily dug behind the outhouse, conveniently located, though the ambience left much to be desired. Drying was another fine option, especially if one didn't mind chewing jerky until it felt like dissolving a leather boot. Meat was sliced thin, salted, and hung near the fire, where the smoke both preserved it and gave it that signature flavor of, well, smoke. Some settlers took to calling this meat prairie bacon. Bacon it decidedly was not, but a hungry stomach isn't much of a food critic. Fruit, if available before the birds and bears got to it, could be dried as well. Apple slices were strung on twine like garlands, not festive but functional, and hung from rafters to dry. The resulting snacks were chewy, sweet, and came with the added thrill of occasionally discovering a dried-up worm. Protein, as they said. Then there was fermentation, which we today love to romanticize in kombucha bars, but back then was less about gut flora and more about not starving. Sauerkraut was a winter staple, shredded cabbage layered with salt in barrels and left to bubble, gurgle, and perfume the cabin with a tangy joie de vivre that overtook even the most stubborn draft. Some townsfolk swore by it, others just swore at it. Pioneer women especially became de facto alchemists, working with smoke, salt, fermentation, vinegar, and the occasional bit of superstition. It wasn't uncommon to see jars of preserves lined up like crystal treasures on high shelves, little time capsules of better seasons. Butter was churned, then packed in crocks and topped with salt to keep it fresh. Eggs were stored in solutions like water glass, which is not as alarming as it sounds. It's a mix of sodium silicate and water that sealed eggs for months. Whether or not the texture remained appealing is another matter. But we're talking survival here, not brunch. Perhaps most curious of all was snow storage. If you packed your food in snow and insulated it just right, it could hold over for weeks, though it also ran the risk of being discovered by a curious bear, which could lead to less of a preservation success and more of a wildlife incident. Some settlers used ice houses, structures filled with blocks of winter ice caught from frozen rivers and packed with sawdust to slow the melt. The result was an 1800s refrigerator, without any of the cheerful humming or helpful lights. Preserving food meant planning, precision, and a touch of bold culinary optimism. Would this jar of molasses stay good through March? Could that smoked trout outlast the snowmelt? Was it really vinegar in that brown jug, or something Sam brewed in the still behind the shed? One never quite knew, but even in the deepest snows, a meal pulled from the hands of summer kept the spirit warm and the belly full. So as twilight glimmered on the frost-furred grass and the cabin filled with wood smoke and sauerkraut fumes, settler families huddled together, grateful for the quiet victory of having anything to eat. And speaking of huddling, next, we'll curl closer to the fire and explore how settlers kept that very flame alive when wood ran low and the prairie did its best impression of outer space. While the snow outside built small, snow-draped mountains on every fence post and chicken coop, life inside a settler's cabin took on the warmth and rhythm of what you might call strategic idleness, that special frontier skill of doing absolutely nothing while technically still surviving winter. Inside those snug little log cabins, the heartbeat of the home was the iron stove, loud enough to creak when it was too, hot and silent enough to make you fear it had died when it wasn't. Feeding it was a full-time occupation. Chopping firewood wasn't just a morning chore. It was a reoccurring existential crisis in Plaid, and every wood pile was a measure of how many degrees of frostbite could be avoided by February. The average cabin was small enough that if you sneezed, your neighbor handed you a blanket without having to get up. Privacy, during those icy months, was more spiritual than practical. Families passed the time in close, sometimes too close quarters. They played cards, told stories, occasionally argued gently over which child was responsible for letting the snow drift in again. It was less about blame and more about, well, it was mostly blame, but cozy blame. Crocheting and knitting kept idle hands busy and industrious minds calm. Women would quietly loop together entire counters worth of socks with the precision of surgeons, while men whittled things for no reason other than the need to whittle. There are documented cases of settlers carving entire miniature rocking chairs just to give their pipe tobacco a place to rest. Sitting still was fine, as long as your hands were doing something vaguely productive, or at the very least, sympathetically motionful. Children, meanwhile, lived in a snow globe version of domestic captivity, with no iPads, no cartoons, and only so many slices of dried apple to nibble at. Their games became inventive, sometimes terrifying. A fan favorite was Find the Mouse, which involved shrieking joyfully every time a small blur dashed past the hearth. Sometimes the blur was just a sibling. Speaking of which, those mice weren't wasting the winter either. The unofficial fifth member of every frontier family was a population of energetic rodents, cheerfully ignoring the laws of personal space. Traps were set with care. But even the most determined settler knew that if you were warm enough to curl up at night, so was something with a twitchy whisker. Entertainment came in other forms too. Oral storytelling was less a hobby and more an Olympic sport. Grandpa might stretch a single memory of a buffalo sighting into a saga longer than a modern streaming series. With no verification system and few interrupters, these tales evolved with each retelling. By midwinter, that buffalo had leapt a canyon, probably spoke Latin, and definitely kicked a bandit in the nose. Sundays, whether in church or improvised in someone's kitchen, brought hymns that filled the cabin with warmth nothing from the stove could match. The collective singing served as both spiritual renewal and a much-needed social occasion. After all, in frontier psychology, the appropriate response to -20 degrees was not despair, but harmony, often sung slightly off-key, but with heart. When cabin fever inevitably settled in, the kind that made the windows seem like unfair barriers and the stew taste like regret, settlers turned to diaries. Written mostly by women, these journals documented the slow poetry of survival. They recorded the weather, the small but vital triumph of stitching a new sleeve, and sometimes the existential dread of running out of coffee. Symbolic crises, sure, but deeply and sincerely lived. Every cup of cornmeal mush or root vegetable stew, every flickering candle or surprise snow leak in the roof, became part of a careful dance. A daily balancing act of warmth versus wind, cheer versus sameness, hope versus frozen plumbing. And through it all, laughter found its way in. Not big roars of hilarity, more like patient chuckles, snorts over misshapen bread loaves, grins when boots thawed in funny positions, giggling fits when the family goose inconveniently laid an egg in someone's mitten. Each laugh was a victory, small but strong. Evenings deepened, and the western sky faded to a velvet blue so dark and starlit it made your breath catch. Candles guttered, the woodpile dwindled, but the cabin held strong, stitched together not just by logs and mortar, but by stories, songs, snoring dogs, and the reassuring knowledge that somehow daybreak would come, even if it took its sweet time. And when the long night pressed in just a little closer, when the cold seemed to kiss the glass with frosty breath, there remained one last ritual to guard bedtime and sanity. A mug of something hot, a blanket pulled to the chin, and a quiet tale. Perhaps about the clever, if not entirely quiet ways settlers made it through the hush and chill of winter holidays on the frontier. Through a cold whisper of wind and the creak of old timbers, the cabin groaned again, just one of the many sounds that kept early settlers company through long, snow-thick nights. Outside, snow heaped like forgotten quilts over fences, barrels, and half-frozen goats that almost definitely regretted living on the frontier. And inside, beneath thick wool blankets and a ceiling of pine, Beam's families passed the bitter hours with quiet industry, and occasionally a bit of candlelit madness. Now, it might surprise you to learn that not every settler evening was spent in silent suffering. Far from it. Once the staples were in, the logs chopped, the cows glared at, and the fire roaring like a bearded uncle at a political rally, most folks still found time to unwind. Leisure, after all, was a form of survival too. So how did they pass the time when winter had locked its icy fingers around their world? Well, if you can picture a kind of prairie slumber party, minus onesies plus a raccoon in the corner, you're on the right track. Domestic entertainment in those isolated homesteads came in forms both practical and peculiar. For example, storytelling was practically a frontier Olympic sport. Fathers spun yarns long enough to knit a scarf with. Tales of dangerous river crossings, ghostly lanterns among the pines, and once, oddly enough, a chicken that could tap, dance. Embellishment was expected, encouraged even. No one wanted a tale that ended with, "and then we went to bed." Snooze. Books were rare but not unheard of. If a family was fortunate enough to own a Bible, a couple dime novels, or something by Longfellow, who was the literary seasoning of the century, they'd read aloud in turns, voices mixing with the moans of the wind. A good reading voice could make or break a dreary January Tuesday. And if reading didn't suit the mood, there were always modest games, sometimes as simple as pebble toss or picket stick, and sometimes as competitive as a full-blown spelling bee, only with fewer rules, more cheating, and the occasional dispute resolved with a strong stare and a mug of lukewarm cider. Music, too, stitched warmth into the winter. Harmonica tunes warbled through drafty walls, fiddles sang in smoky corners, and makeshift drums, think pots and deeply offended pans, kept the rhythm. Even the most tone-deaf uncle got a solo, usually accompanied by an encouraging nod and the silent prayer it would be short. But let us not forget the great unsung hero of winter nights: handiwork, mending, quilting, whittling. These weren't just chores. These were meditative arts. There's something deeply calming about stitching squares of thrifted cloth, while your toes steam near the fire and someone mutters gently about the quality of shoe leather these days. Among womenfolk, quilting circles weren't just a necessity. They were a form of social sorcery. Threads weren't merely sewn. They were woven with gossip, songs, and subtle judgment about Martha's new bonnet. Men, too, had their rituals, like carving elaborate whistles out of scrap wood that they swore had some survival purpose, but mostly just annoyed livestock. And yet, not all was cheerful. Cabin fever, aptly named, was a real thing. After weeks of shared close quarters and the same stew 3 nights running, tempers could thin like black coffee. Arguments would bubble up over the placement of a kettle or the proper way to fold a blanket. These were lovingly dramatic disputes, of course, often resolved by time or laughter, or just giving up and staring at the fire together in mutual existential bewilderment. Fire watching, by the way, might have been the era's favorite pastime. Flames were hypnotic companions, dancing on their own secret schedule, whispering tales in crackles and collapses. People would sit for hours watching logs burn down, fascinated the way one might watch waves, or, in our modern age, a truly aggressive lava lamp. Sleep, when it came, was treasured, not necessarily because it was peaceful, but because it was shared. Whole families slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed, bundled like a heap of puppies. The comforting sound of everyone else breathing, snoring, or occasionally muttering about tap-dancing chickens formed a strange sort of lullaby. And above all this, night after night, the wind would continue its lonely courtship with the world, brushing snow from the branches and patting old roofs like a watchful guardian. The cold may have been bitter, but the communities, the families, the dreams that flickered in candlelight, they were nothing if not warm. Now, if you listen closely, just beyond the rustle of the cabin's woven curtains, another kind of movement begins, slow, deliberate, and promising. A soft shift towards spring, or at least the first signs of survival's reward. But before the thaw, there's one more tale to tell. As December settled on the frontier, blanketing the land in a stubborn quilt of white, the great American West tucked itself in for a long and drafty sleep. For settlers, winter was neither friend nor foe. It was more like that awkward dinner guest who refused to leave, but occasionally brought pie. Life inside a settler's cabin during the colder months was a lesson in patience, patchwork, and peculiar smells. The cabins were usually one-room structures, built hastily with rough-hewn logs and questionable optimism. With moss or mud jammed between the logs for insulation, an early take on frontier feng shui. The goal was to keep the wind from casually joining you at the dinner table. And the wind did love to visit, especially at night. It howled through the cracks like a gossipy ghost and made the shutters rattle in nervous agreement. A single open flame, perhaps from a fireplace that smoked like it had secrets, was often the only heat source. If the fire went out, so did your chances of a good night's sleep. One had to stoke it continuously, a job passed down to the poor soul who drew the short stick, usually a fidgety child or a sleepy parent with a heroic bladder. Quilts were currency in the cold months. If you'd managed to sew a few during warmer days, using everything from worn-out trousers to potato sacks with aspirations, you were considered quite the domestic tycoon. Layer upon layer of cloth, tucked tight under the chin and even tighter around the toes, became your nightly armor. Of course, not everything went smoothly indoors. Life was, let's say, snug. There was no personal space in a one-room cabin. Everyone simply existed in the same shared cloud of breaths, body heat, and the lingering scent of boiled cabbage. Pets were not so much companions as they were additional heat sources. If a dog looked at you in winter, it wasn't affection. He had designs on your side of the bed. There was a certain rhythm to winter days. Chores shrank with the sun, meals thickened with the temperature, and time itself seemed to stretch like cold molasses. Breakfast might be cornmeal mush again, because cornmeal mush was always there for you. Lunch was usually a modest continuation of breakfast, and supper was a hopeful reimagining of dried beans. Variety wasn't a thing, it was more of a memory. But the mind is a clever traveller, especially when the body is nestled by the fire. Long winter evenings were prime time for stories. These weren't just idle tales, they were yarns, spun with the warmth of exaggeration and the occasional fictional bear wrestling incident. The local trapper would share tales of ice storms so fierce they froze the air itself, while Granny Mabel might recall the time your father wore his snowshoes backward for 3 days without noticing. No one corrected him. The incident lived on. Music, if you had an instrument, could elevate a humble evening to near festivity. A fiddle, poorly tuned but enthusiastically played, could make your feet tap, even if they were completely numb. And laughter, though perhaps muffled by scarves and general weariness, was the frontier's best medicine. That, and a surprising amount of boiled onions. Yet, winter wasn't without its quiet magic. The view outside the frostbitten window pane, a simple sheet of greased paper perhaps, might show the prairie wrapped in moonlight, sparkling like someone had spilled the stars. Animals left intricate patterns in the snow, like messages just barely out of reach. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the silence between their cries was somehow even louder. By late January, when hope was thinner than the soup, seed catalogues began to circulate, if you were lucky enough to have one. These crude but colourful pages were less about gardening and more about fantasy. You could stare at a picture of watermelon and feel your soul sigh. One day, you'd murmur, we'll eat something that doesn't crunch from being frozen. And so, winter endured, not conquered, but endured. Through itchy wool and lukewarm stew, through cabin whispers and cracking joints, the settlers taught themselves to wait, to work, and most of all, to find moments of light in the long, pressing dark. Now, imagine the fire dwindling just slightly, casting shadows that dance like old friends on the walls. Outside, the wind settles, wrapped in its own snowdrift dreams. Inside, wrapped in patchwork and stories, our weary pioneers drift closer to whatever came next. Just after sunset, when the prairie turned shy and blushed in soft blues, a curl of chimney smoke told the story of another day survived. Inside a rough-hewn log cabin, the kind that creaked at every wind whistle and had precisely one window, drafty of course, a family gathered around a fire that wasn't quite roaring, but did its best. The cabin was a patchwork of fixed things, patched roof, patched clothes, patched plans, and yet it was enough. The long winter was at its tail end, or so people said. Settlers often claimed spring was just around the corner, though it was unclear which corner. They'd been saying that since November. Still, it was something to believe in. Spring would come, probably. Supper had long since retreated into their bellies. Something stewed, something boiled, something vaguely meat adjacent. Now came the quiet hour. The moment when the wind outside sighed like a tired ox and conversation turned dreamlike. Sometimes stories were shared, folk tales as weathered as the floorboards. Other times, everyone just sat, letting the silence do the speaking. Children would nod off mid-sentence, tumbling into rough quilts stuffed with everything from horsehair to something suspiciously crunchy. Adults stayed up a little longer, poking at the fire as if it might tell them tomorrow's weather. They knew the worst storms came not with warning, but with whimsy. One day, the sky would be blue, and the next, you'd wake up to a door that didn't open because a snowdrift had decided it was now a wall. Yet the ingenuity was astounding. These were people who, in the face of sub-zero winds and grocery stores that were several hundred miles and 50 rattlesnakes away, found ways to endure with a shrug and a stovepipe. They pickled, they smoked, they dried. And when supplies ran low, they made do. A bit of salt pork and a whole lot of imagination went a long way. In the loft above, no attic, just a board stretched near the ceiling. Young ones dreamed in layers of socks wrapped like burritos in family-made quilts. Out of necessity, settlers went to bed early. With candles scarce and kerosene even scarcer, darkness had its own authority. Night came early, and morning took its sweet time showing up. And by then, someone had to chop more wood. Still, even in the biting chill, there was a wonder to it all. The sheer absurdity of survival. The quiet pride in heat earned by splitting logs until your arms hum with effort. Sharing stories that had been told 100 times because they'd be told 100 more. Wearing mittens that didn't match and answering nature's chill with stubborn, wool-clad optimism. We look back now and marvel, and maybe laugh gently at the idea of snow being both enemy and insulation. Because yes, piling snow high against the outside of a cabin actually helped keep heat in. The same substance that froze your beard into a brittle icicle was also your insulation technician. There's beauty in that contradiction. Some nights, during the coldest stretches, families would all sleep in the same bed. Yes, this could cause minor turf wars over blanket rights, but it also meant survival. A group of bodies, packed together like sausages, generated enough warmth to fend off the teeth of the wind. No one cared about personal space when frostbite had an open invitation to your toes. Of course, not everyone made it. Winters were not romantic for those who risked starvation, sickness, or wolves who didn't care what your bedtime story was. But even amid tragedy, there were countless stories of stubborn joy. Fiddle music played with frostbitten fingers, pies made from forgotten root vegetables, laughter crackling louder than the fire. Eventually, winter did loosen its grip. It always did. And the settler families would emerge, like blinking bears, discovering that the snow had melted into mud, the mud into grass, and life went on. Babies were born, fences were mended, and seeds were pushed into thawed earth. But here, tonight, the cabin is quiet. The fire has settled into its sleepy orange heartbeat. The wind sighs, not angry anymore, but more like it's just stretching its arms. Outside, the snow lays tucked under moonlight, peaceful in its blankness. Inside, the last candle flickers once, then settles. And with that, the long winter night and our little time together comes to an end. Sleep well, traveller of time. You've earned it.